SEC bias. It's a phrase thrown around a lot when it comes to college football, and college football is right around the corner, so I kind of want to, talk about it. First off, I'm not an SEC fan. In fact, I'm not a fan of any conference. I'm a Notre Dame fan. My first note about the SEC is that they really care about being in the conference. They take a lot of pride in being in this conference. Other conferences don't really do that. I've never seen an Ohio State fan, cheer for Michigan to win the championship just because they're in the Big Ten. That's just something that doesn't happen. SEC fans kind of claim themselves as the best conference, and the media kind of goes along with it. Do I think the SEC has been the best conference in recent history? Yes, but they're not a million times better than every other conference like they kind of say they are. And they definitely have some biases. First thing, boosting. My theory on boosting in the SEC is that, the polls rate the SEC as high as they can, and even within the SEC, there are different kind of tiers to SEC that they give favorable rankings. The first tier would be Alabama, Georgia, LSU, then, tier 2 teams, tier 3 teams, and Vanderbilt. On average, these are the tiers. Obviously, like Missouri was more than a tier 3 school last year, but over the past 10 years, these are kind of the average. Basically, I think polls will rate, lower tier SEC teams as high as they possibly can to make the higher tier SEC teams look better when they actually beat those teams. For my first example, let's flash back to 2021. Florida went into the season 17th, and they beat Florida Atlantic and then South Florida. Started off 2-0. They got ranked all the way up to 11th in the country right before they faced number 1 Alabama. And of course, Florida would lose that game to number 1 Alabama. It was actually a close game. It ended 31-29. Alabama barely squeaked it out. Now at the time, it looked like Alabama just beat the 11th best team in the country. Then you flash forward to the end of the year, and Florida ended 6-7. They just for no reason got ranked super duper high just to lose to Alabama. A couple years ago, Kentucky also did this. They boosted Kentucky all the way up to 7th in the nation after beating Miami, Ohio, a bad Florida team, Youngstown State, and an 8-point victory against Northern Illinois. And they'd stayed ranked after going 1-2 and then got smoked by number 3 Tennessee. Kentucky would go on to finish the season unranked. My last main example is Arkansas from 2022. After going 3-0, they were boosted all the way to 10th in the country, just to lose to Texas A&M, and Arkansas would finish the season 6-6. I think they won their bowl game, but you can make any conference look really good when you boost them as high as possible. I mean, last year Rutgers was 3-0 before going to face Michigan, but they weren't ranked high because they didn't deserve to, because they had undeserving wins. These SEC teams usually get 4 very easy games, maybe 1 conference game to start the year every year. And after those 4 games, the AP poll will rate them super duper high if they win these easy games, and then usually they'll have a higher tier SEC opponent to play, and usually they lose and make the other team look better. SEC bias can also clearly be seen when it comes to start and end of the year ranks. I mean, just looking at this most recent AP poll, LSU coming at 13 and Tennessee coming at 15. I think both of those are pretty bad rankings. LSU finished 12th last year, but lost their Heisman quarterback, their offensive coordinator, and 2 phenomenal wide receivers, and their defense was pretty bad last year. I don't know how they regressed 1 spot when teams like Arizona regressed 10 spots, even though they kept most of their talent except lost their head coach. That puts them all the way behind Texas A&M, which went 7-6 last year. It's hard to argue that some of these top SEC teams like Missouri, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, all those schools are pretty fairly ranked, but when it comes to the more in-depth of the SEC, they get ranked way too high when they don't deserve it. I mean, Tennessee too, they're a team that so far the entire team is just hype. There's not really much proven, and Oklahoma State has the number 1 running back in the country and the number 1 O-line, and they're ranked below them. And it all comes down to just, the SEC is a better conference. That's all it comes down to, which just comes out of nowhere, and I think the rankings can be terrible. And there's some even worse rankings at the end of seasons. I mean, just look at the end of the year in 2022. Alabama, a Tier 1 SEC school, to what I think, gets put ahead of Tennessee, even though Tennessee beat them during that season and they had the same record. It's just bias. Then in 2019, we see 11-2 Florida placed ahead of a playoff Oklahoma team that went 12-2. They jumped them somehow, even though they still had less losses. And even then, they were the highest ranked 11-2 team. The two SEC teams that went 11-2 were the two highest ranked ones. A couple years ago, we see 9-4 Auburn ranked ahead of 10-3 Iowa and 11-3 Utah. Even flashing back to 2016, this can be seen where LSU is ranked ahead of 10 teams that had a better record than them. These happen because of so-called strength of schedule, and they make this way more important than it actually is. I feel like we should look at how they got those wins. I mean, my main example is Florida State getting snubbed out of the playoff for Alabama. Alabama had the higher strength of schedule. That is true. They won the SEC, but not only did they lose, but they barely squeaked out a win against 2-4 Arkansas. They needed a miracle to beat Texas A&M, and then obviously needed an even bigger miracle to beat 6-5 Auburn. Those are very close games against teams that aren't that good. To be fair, Florida State had kind of a stinker against Boston College where they only won by 2, but that was Florida State's only one possession win of the entire season. Yet even with a better record and they're more dominant against the teams they played, they get snubbed for it. And they say it's because of TCU. TCU last year, what did TCU do last year? They won a playoff game. So I think that's a terrible point to make as to why we shouldn't include Florida State in the playoff. Yes, Florida State would go on to get smoked by Georgia, but those were like Florida State third strings. They had like 20 players opt out. Any team is going to lose to Georgia when they play with their third strings. That's just not plausible. I don't know why people are like, yeah, that proves that Florida State didn't deserve it. Florida State did deserve it, and they won the ACC. It just shows pure bias when you say the SEC is so much better than the ACC that a team that won the SEC with a worse record can make it over a team that won the ACC going undefeated. Just, their quarterback's hurt. That doesn't mean anything. All right, that doesn't mean anything to what they accomplished. All in all, I think the SEC does get a bunch of, favors and preferential rankings from the AP and playoff committee because of history. I think, you just got to look at the team this year. You can't say, oh, well, they've shown that they can win it before. If we want other teams to compete, you can't do that. Thanks for watching, guys.